So next, I do want to turn the floor over to Dr. Delton Chen, who's going to be talking about the Global Carbon Reward. Thank you.
Before I start, I'd just like to thank the UN Global Innovation Hub for inviting me to speak today. Much appreciated. Today I'm speaking about the Global Carbon Reward Policy. It's a new international climate policy for providing climate finance at speed and scale. Polycrisis. Have you heard the word polycrisis? What it means is that we're actually facing not just a climate crisis, but it's a complex crisis comprised of political conflict, economic problems, and physical crises. Political, because we can't agree on who's going to pay for mitigation, how much fossil fuels to use. It's an economic crisis because standard policies aren't working, carbon markets aren't really working, they're not properly additional, and economically, globally, there's extreme inequality, particularly between the global north and the global south. And physically, we're facing a crisis because of positive feedbacks, tipping elements in the climate system and the earth system, which cause more impacts and risks as the planet warms. For example, we could have deadly heat waves that impact billions of people if the temperature exceeds 2 degrees of global warming. This novel, The Ministry for the Future, some of you may have heard of that novel. It might even become a film one day, but Kim Stanley Robinson did a great job of bringing this polycrisis to life in a fictional story. And he uses in the story a carbon coin and central bank policy to resolve the climate crisis. So what's interesting about this novel is that the plot, the carbon coin, is actually based on this policy. In the real policy, the instrument is actually called a carbon currency, or XCC, and the unit of account is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent strategically mitigated for 100 years. So the word strategic is very important because this policy only funds actions that are going to be additional and make a significant difference. It has a more of a top-down approach in certain ways as well as bottom-up. Carbon currency is not going to be a medium of exchange. You can't use it to buy things, and it's not a carbon credit. So you cannot use it to offset emissions. No offsetting, it reduces the risks. And the question then is, if there's no offsetting, how do we fund this carbon currency? How do you create demand? Well, the demand's created through monetary policy, and that's a picture of the Federal Reserve. The point being that central banks today do not have a mandate for directly funding climate mitigation, but this policy and the theory behind it, it argues that we need new mandates, expanded mandates for central banks to back our carbon currency proposal. So to give this some numbers, you've probably seen these sorts of charts. It's the hypothetical emissions scenario for 1.5. This is historical, and we have policies that are set in place will take us over 2.5 degrees. Pledges might take us down to 2 if they're enforced, and then the Paris compliant 1.5 is very steep, declining quickly. We would still have residual emissions, thus we would still need to remove large amounts of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere even to achieve 1.5. So you already know that. Standard economics says that we need to tax the emissions from $40 to $100 a tonne before 2030, increasing to 200 and more beyond that. The finance gap is of the order of $3 or more trillion a year to do the reductions, which are blue. And the cost of removal could easily be $1 trillion a year to remove the red. So how do we fund this transition and break through the political and economic gridlock? The answer we have with this policy is to provide 3 major reward rules that provide scalable climate finance, debt-free, for cleaner energy, cleaner business, and the carbon removal. The third rule is the most straightforward. It's a fully market-based approach with an explicit price, and I'll show you the price in a moment. So we'll move our focus to rules 1 and 2. So cleaner energy, basically, with this approach, with this policy, we potentially can resolve the deadlock over fossil fuels. As you would have heard, the world's planning to extract more than double the amount of fossil fuels that's allowed for 1.5 degrees. So what we can do with the clean energy rule is actually pay to keep fossil fuels in the ground with conditions that the recipient of the reward needs to use most of that carbon reward to build out cleaner energy substitutes. That way we accelerate the transition from dirty to clean energy. Rule 2 is all about reducing demand for fossil fuels and speeding up the transition on the consumption side of energy. So rules 1 and 2 is based on flexible prices and highly strategic planning, quite top-down. Rule 3 for carbon removal, it's an explicit global price and really very market-based, bottom-up. I'm going to explain now the financial mechanism, and this should demystify how the policy works. So what happens is the world, if it agrees to the policy, would set up what's called a carbon exchange authority, a new international organisation with a mandate to enforce international standards for carbon mitigation, somewhat similar to what we see today, but more universal. And it will issue service level agreements for projects to sign. If they agree to the conditions, they can earn the carbon currency. So the awardees will earn carbon currency as they do the good work. Then at the time that they want to realise the purchasing power of that carbon currency, they need to sell it into foreign exchange markets where they'll trade it for real currency. If the private demand is not sufficient, then central banks will buy up the carbon currency because they are the guarantors of the policy. And they'll simply expand the money supply and record the carbon currency as their asset. This is the floor price for our carbon currency proposal, and it's calibrated specifically to fund the minimum safe amount of carbon removal the world will need. That's to avoid a moral hazard. And it's a way of defining what the minimum value should be, the thick black line, and that thick black line will be backed by central banks via monetary policy. So the actual exchange rate will fluctuate under market forces. So that's the spot price. The main implication here is really very important and dramatic, and that is, with this approach, what's actually happening is the private sector is paying for most of the mitigation, because they're going to buy the carbon currency because it's going to appreciate in value, it's an investable asset, and so that's why we have this fluctuating spot price over many decades. When the market's saturated, then the central banks will be the buyers of last resort. So, as an example, just imagine in the Congo Basin, where there's planned oil and gas extraction, we need to protect those forests, the peat forests and so on. Those developing countries, they need that revenue though, so it's very difficult for them not to drill. But we can buy out the leases, lock down the fossil fuels for 100 years or more, pay them carbon currency debt-free with these service level agreements, then they will build cleaner energy assets to substitute with conditions for co-benefits for communities, ecosystems, and so on. This is the last slide. I think I just have another minute or two. So I just wanted to conclude with some opportunities for digital platforms to stay in theme with this presentation. What we're going to create with the carbon reward is actually a multi-trillion-dollar carbon market that would supersede the existing carbon markets from the point of view it will provide a long-term reliable price that's scalable. So to support it, we would need all the technologies from the Internet of Things, satellites. We need the full services for data storage, tracking, analysis, like was being discussed here today, contracts, MRV, training, certification, e-commerce, investing, accountability, and policing. So Web 2, Web 3, artificial intelligence, and extended reality would be very useful technologies to help manage the platform for doing the measurement, reporting, verification, and so on. What's unique to this policy, however, is another kind of platform that's for monitoring and reporting co-benefits and harms to communities and ecosystems. So in this policy, there's a secondary price signal that's prescribed in a way that we collect information from communities in a decentralized manner and use this to adjust the carbon rewards. That way we encourage co-benefits and good quality carbon and responsible development in a virtuous circle of decarbonisation. So that can be managed through smartphones, the internet, and using consensus models to determine subjectively how to adjust the rewards to incentivise more co-benefits and fewer harms. So thank you.